Chapter 9. Dusk of Youth. 10 years had passed since they first began their classes. 18 summers, according to Vacuo's reckoning, had passed since the majority of their births. Olivia had taken a liking to engineering. Knowing how things worked fascinated her, and made her an invaluable resource when it came to study hours. Not regarding the preparation itself, but making the material understandable. The instructor had gone from a drill master and a war veteran to a professor in the years of inactivity he spent with the students. To see him in combat again was an afterthought in the majority of their minds, yet somehow they hadn't lost any of the respect he demanded from them. They felt safe around him, even if they weren't always sure of his intentions. Olivia made many friends in the now completed school, a fortress as much as a campus in its own right. The powers became gathering places, where lectures were translated into jokes that had somehow made everything easier for them to handle. Daniel had only grown further, being larger than most adults as a child. His genetics made him comparable to an Ursa, an observation he never took offense to even when spoken by his own teammates. Havilah and Gideon remained on the sidelines. Appreciating the light-hearted atmosphere, Havilah began practicing her sums, and seeing mathematical patterns as amusing as one of Olivia's pranks to the average student. Gideon likewise occupied himself with his sword by balancing it at different angles on his palm and continually testing its weight. The results had shown. Havilah's semblance made her a natural athlete, and Gideon had found himself alongside her more and more often in recent days. After a muscle cramp caused Gideon to falter in his exercises, Havilah closed her scroll and looked down beside him. "I'm surprised you didn't throw up that time." Gideon let out a forced laugh. "Arm work and leg work are two different things, Fox Lady." Olivia had never grasped the proper pronunciation of her name since the day they had met. The oversimplification had stuck like her study hall routines. Taking his riposte in stride, she punched his shoulder and offered him the rare privilege of a compliment. "I see your mind is almost as sharp as your blade." Bringing it up resulted in a long silence on his part. "Sleeping?" Gideon shook his head and left. Havilah kicked herself for forgetting, but decided she could only beat herself up for this for so long. Her emotions had passed, and she allowed them to run their course. Gideon went back to their room to continue his exercises in private. Daniel and Red noticed and left the group that was hearing Olivia do impressions of the instructor's thick accent. Daniel rested his massive hand on Havilah's shoulder and didn't offer any words, just a reminder they all needed. Her top shoulder muscle tensed and she mockingly started to lock his elbow and attempt to throw him over her shoulder. He laughed, feigning shock before coupling them both in one of his famous Ursa hugs. Red groaned as his stomach scar ached, and Daniel apologetically let go. Without words, they understood what they had learned in the instructor's lecture on relationships. Gideon was going to deal with his problems on his own. He would rather give them space than assume they were all the same type of person. "Are you curious about what the instructor said today?" Daniel's low voice resembled a subtle growl that put Havilah's instincts on edge. It wasn't something she had yet gotten used to, though all of them had changed over the years. Hiding her notes, she simply adjusted her ear back his direction, gesturing for him to elaborate. "I mean concerning our weapons. That guy from Atlas we met on our first day is coming back. What do you think he'll be bringing us?" Havilah hadn't given the matter much thought. Her focus always went towards the academic over the theoretical. "I'm sure we'll find out this afternoon." Olivia continued entertaining her fellow students, and their intermittent laughter distracted her. Dropping down her ears as a sense of irritation, Olivia seemed to sense the tension across the room and began gesturing to them that she was finished. Conclusively groaning, they dispersed, and Olivia quickly made her way over to where they were sitting. "Sorry about that," Olivia whispered. "Apparently the high-pitched tones the instructor always makes whenever he wants us to pay attention really gets them giggly." Havilah's ears remained down, but waved away her apologies with a hand. "It's fine, I just—" Daniel interrupted as she began to trail off. "She mentioned the sword." Olivia's bubbly personality rarely seemed to abate unless someone turned down the temperature in the room. The light in her eyes seemed to die when she understood the situation. A brief moment of silence fell between them until their scrolls all received a message. At each of their own paces, they reached for them and saw it was the instructor. Looking at Havilah, Olivia brought back to life the situation almost as if it was a subconscious reflex for her. "Come on, Fox Lady, we'll see him on the way." Grinning, Havilah gathered up her notes and made her way with them to the lecture hall. Navigating the halls came more naturally to them as time passed. When it became a routine, knowing what to do and where to go was as second nature to them as their own self-preservation when they all found themselves scattered throughout the desert as children. Making their way into the classroom, they saw Gideon was already seated and joined them without a word. The instructor stood where he always had and waited for the rest of them to make their ways in without mentioning anything. When the last of them had taken their seats, he signaled what they all now knew would tell them what they would be learning that day. It simply read the words, "Draw weapons." Looking at each other, each student reached to where they kept them and stood up unsure of what was going to happen next. Olivia's knife had been modified to her high-energy techniques with a long guitar string, capable of cutting as easily as the blade itself. After a few lessons in engineering, she even found a way to make it retract when clenching her fists. To avoid a risk of cutting herself when handling the string, she also sported a pair of Kevlar gloves whenever she used them. Pulling the gloves up to her wrist, she flexed her fingers while holding the knife's handle to her palm with her thumb. Daniel's routine was fairly straightforward. He unbuckled a heavy one-handed hammer from his belt and allowed himself a few practice swings to get used to the weight. It had seen better days and was often exposed to more refinement and maintenance than the iron it was made from could handle. Yet despite the warping and weathering, it remained strong. Olivia expanded what at first looked like a shoulder strap into a longbow that she had used as the handle to her knapsack, treating it as an inside joke that only she knew despite the fact everyone was aware of what it actually was. She sheepishly grinned and turned on her heel to see the non-existent shocked expressions of those around her. She was the only one laughing at her own jokes at times, but it never stopped her from making them. Gideon always held his blade in his right hand and merely stood to his feet. He rose its point to the center mass of whoever he was looking at, as he had been instructed. His reading worked himself beyond irritation and even into exhaustion learning about the proper handling of this tool, and it showed. The instructor didn't draw his spear. He merely observed the range of weapons around him. "To those who can, place your weapons at your feet." Once again, confused by his words, they began placing their weapons down. Those who had lost limbs and given weaponized prosthetics were given specific glances from the instructor that they understood meant they were exempt from his orders. Gideon didn't need the glance. He remained as he was. The last decade had been mostly an educational pursuit for all of them. Learning combat techniques rather than using them had become the norm, and the weapons they carried were as attached to each of them as a civilian would view their home. For those who understood what was about to happen, acceptance only came as easy as their emotions allowed. Havilah felt the grief come and attempted to push it back down. Daniel and Olivia both rested their hands on her shoulders, and even Gideon glanced at her to help break the bad habit. No objections were voiced, but some wept looking at their weapons like a child would look at a toy that had just become obsolete. The representative from Atlas was then signaled to enter the room. His many boxes and materials entered the room behind him without any wheels or guidance save the presence of their maker. His hair had grayed over the years since they all had last seen each other. The long, faded memories of the Great War barely resembled sparks at this moment. Those who had learned from history all met together for a common purpose. "It's good to see you all again." The weight of age made his words carry only to the ears of those willing to listen. Yet despite his frailty, his mind seemed as sharp as ever. "You all have learned so much, and I am proud to see you all so grown up. As I stood among children and saw you already shaped into weapons the grim learned to fear, you are all now warriors, capable of doing things you wouldn't imagine possible when you were all on your own. Like all those who dwell in your region, the strong only get stronger.
I am honored to be welcomed into your midst, and hope to pass my strength on to the next generation.
With a gesture, the boxes that hovered just above the floor all opened at his command. Instead of completed weapons, they all saw materials that were labeled with each group's room numbers. It was then that the instructor stepped forward. You learn to fight with these tools. You will now use all that you have learned to craft the weapons that your lives will depend on. The representative continued.
I happily donated my nation's resources to help rebuild your lives. Now you will use these resources to preserve those of others, and with them you too will commit them to those who can be trusted to do the same.
The representative turned to the instructor.
What do you have them call you again?
The students, still coming to terms with the loss of their weapons they had each trained with for the last 10 years, were suddenly giving their attention to him at what sounded like a story.
Teacher? Elder? Master? Colonel?
At a tone lower than his aged voice could produce, the instructor suddenly looked embarrassed, a sight none of them had ever seen before. The representative laughed throatily and turned back to the students.
I was the first to lay down my arms against your nation when I met this fellow. Not out of sympathy at first. It was after I learned.
The instructor cut him off abruptly, but knew the gesture was pointless. He held the attention of the entire room and knew it was already too late. Letting out a breath, he finished the story from his own mouth. I was captured when I wouldn't abandon my post and stood alone. Hiding in the ashes, they gave me a nickname when I was a prisoner of war. Timmy here, emphasizing his name, allowing the students to laugh at first to soften the blow when the story came back to the point the representative was going to make. Was told to interrogate me, and I only gave him 2 answers, my name and status. Tim's cackle began again as he knew what was coming, warming up the classroom to what was about to be said.
And what was that answer again?
The instructor let out a long sigh. Ashpen. The ground shook, and what sounded like a thunderclap reverberated through the classroom, causing all of the students to draw up the weapons that had formerly been resting at their feet. The instructor, almost too eagerly, began coordinating each group to their station until the threat had been assessed as weather, grim, or anything else. Representative Tim closed the boxes with another gesture and seemed completely unfazed by the sudden rise in tension. With a whisper to the instructor, he took up his spear and signaled to Havalia's group to take the vanguard position to the hangar. Whatever had happened, it had something to do with him. Daniel and Gideon both continued to stare at him for a moment longer until they joined their group behind the instructor. The look they both gleaned from the aging engineer was regret, a look they both knew very well.